It's a real pleasure to be here this evening and to come after so many wonderful talks and performances. I had a panicked thought this weekend when I was thinking about tonight, and I didn't know whether the Bears were playing tonight, and I thought, oh my goodness, what if they are, and it would just be the five of us. And maybe someone in the corner who would just be checking their cell phone the entire time for updates. So I'm very grateful the NFL scheduling gods agreed with Ideas Week. I wanted to tell a story that obsessed me when I was writing my new book. It's a story about something that happened 3,000 years ago in the area of Palestine known as the Shephelah. And the reason it interests me and obsessed me so much was that I thought I understood this story, and then I realized that I didn't. The ancient Israel was centered in the beginning on three cities, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Hebron. And they were up in the mountainous area that runs down the eastern side of Palestine. And the mountains give way to a big flat plain, which is where Tel Aviv is now. And in between these two areas is the Shephelah, which is a series of ridges and valleys that link the mountains to the plain. And if you've ever been to Israel, you know this is just about the most beautiful part of the whole country. It's got wheat fields, and it's got vineyards, and it's got beautiful oak forests. But the real significance, though, of the Shephelah is strategic. Because if you are living on the coastal plain, it's the means by which you find your way into the mountains. Right? It's the means by which you can go and attack people living in the mountains. And 3,000 years ago, that's exactly what happens. The Philistines are living on the plain. They're a seafaring people from Crete. And they decide that they're going to make their way up one of those ridges and occupy a high ridge near Bethlehem and split the fledgling kingdom of Israel in two. And King Saul, who is the head of the Israelites, hears about this and comes down the mountain to meet the Philistines. And the two sides meet each other in an area called the Valley of Elah. And the Israelites dig in along the northern ridge of the valley, and the Philistines dig in along the southern ridge, and they sit there and they just stare at each other, because neither can attack each other. To attack would mean you'd have to come up over the ridge, down the side of the valley, and then up the other side, and you would hopelessly expose yourself to your enemy, so no one can move. And they sit there and they look at each other for weeks. And finally the Philistines say, this is ridiculous, and they send down one of their mightiest warriors to challenge a mighty warrior from the Israelite side to a duel. This was in ancient times called single combat, and it was a tradition by which battles could be resolved with just a duel between two men. And the warrior the Philistines send down is a giant. He's 6'9", and he's outfitted in this head to toe in glittering bronze armor, and he's got a sword, and he's got a spear, and he's got a javelin, and he's completely terrifying. And the Israelites look at this guy, and no one wants to fight him because it's certain death, right? Until a shepherd boy comes forward and says, I'll do it. And Saul looks at this kid and says, it's ridiculous, you can't do it. And the kid says, yes, I can. I've been a shepherd. I've had experience killing lions and wolves. I think I can take this guy. And Saul's got no choice, right? No one else is coming forward. So he says, all right, very reluctantly, and he tries to give the shepherd boy his armor. He says, you're going to need this armor. And the shepherd boy tries it on, then just takes it off and says, no, I can't use it, right? I'm not used to it at all. Instead, he reaches down and he picks up 5 stones from the ground and puts them in his satchel and makes his way down the mountain, right? And the giant is waiting for his foe to arrive, catches some glimpse, and shouts out, come to me so I can feed your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field, right? He's taunting this guy. And the shepherd boy gets even closer, and the giant sees that the kid's got a staff, a shepherd's staff. he says, he's insulted by this. Like, what on earth are they sending a kid with a shepherd towards him? He goes, come, he says, am I a dog that you will come to me with sticks? Right? He's insulted. And the shepherd boy draws nearer and nearer, and he says, I may not have all of the weapons you have, but I come in the spirit of God Almighty. And he takes one of those stones from his satchel, and he puts it in his sling, and he winds it up, and he lets fire, and the stone hits the giant right between the eyes. He falls over dead. The shepherd boy comes up, and he cuts off his head, and the Philistines run back to the coastal plain, right? The shepherd boy's name, obviously, is David, right? And the giant's name is Goliath. And the reason I got so obsessed with that story is that I came to understand that nearly everything I thought was true about that story wasn't true at all. Now, that story has kind of entered the vernacular. Whenever we talk about any kind of conflict between two sides with very different levels of power and ability and authority, we call it a David and Goliath conflict, right? We consider David to be the underdog and Goliath to be the overwhelming favorite. Now, why do we think that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is obviously that David is a kid and Goliath is giant, right? 6'9". Second is that David is inexperienced as a warrior. He's a shepherd. He's not someone. Whereas Goliath is considered to be one of the mightiest warriors in all of the land. But most of all, the reason we say that is because of the weapons they have. Right? Goliath has got a sword and a javelin and a spear, and he's outfitted in armor, and all David has is a sling. Think about that phrase for a moment. All David has is a sling. It's a good place to start, because that's the first of the problems that I think we have with that story. Ancient armies in that era had basically three different kinds of warriors. They had cavalry, men on horseback or in chariots, right? They had heavy infantry, men in armor with swords and shields and javelins and spears. And they had artillery, archers, but more importantly, slingers, right? A slinger was someone who had a leather pouch with two long cords attached to it, and they would put a stone in this leather pouch, and they would swing it round and round and round like this, and they would release one of the ends of the pouch, and the rock would go forward. Right? A sling was not, in other words, a slingshot. It's not this. It's not a child's toy. It's something very different. It's one of the most devastating weapons in the ancient world. Right? So when you swing a sling around like this, you're swinging it at roughly 6 to 7 revolutions per second, which means that when you release one of those cords, the rock is going to go forward at around 35 meters per second, which is to say that if Goliath was at the other end of the stage and I'm David, the rock's going to reach him in under a second. Right? That's not giving someone a lot of time to react. I talked to this really hilarious ballistics expert with the Israeli Defense Force who had done the math on this. And he said, once you understand that the rocks in the Valley of Elah are barium sulfate, which are twice the weight, the density of normal rocks. And if you calculate that in, it means that the stopping power of that rock that came from David's sling was equal to the stopping power of a .45 caliber pistol, right? Now, what about accuracy? Well, we know from looking at medieval tapestries and also other biblical accounts of slingers that these guys, if they were experienced, were really, really good. The Bible talks about slingers being capable of hitting a target far away with the accuracy of it within a hair's breadth. Right? In the tapestries, we see pictures of slingers hitting birds in flight. These guys are really, really good. There is no question that if David was experienced as he said he was, the use of the sling, that he could absolutely have knocked Goliath dead with the force of that kind of impact. And we know in ancient times that slingers were routinely used against heavy infantry with devastating effect. So what is Goliath? He's heavy infantry. And he's under the assumption that he's going to be fighting someone else who is heavy infantry. That's why he's weighed down with his armor and got his sword at the ready. Saul has the same assumption. He tries to give David his armor because he thinks that David too is going to be adhering to the conventions of single combat, which said that what you did was you had a sword fight. But David has no intention of doing that. Why would he? He's a shepherd. He spent his whole life practicing with the sling. He's going to use a sling against this giant. And against a sling, the giant is a sitting duck. He's this big, lumbering guy who can barely move, who's weighted down with 100 pounds of armor up against a weapon which has historically been used against heavy infantry. Doesn't stand a chance, right? So why do we keep calling David an underdog? There's a second part of this that's interesting, and that's about Goliath. It's not just the case that we have radically underestimated David's power in that conflict. It's also the case that we've underestimated, or rather we have been mistaken in our appreciation of Goliath. Goliath is supposed to be this mighty warrior, right? He's the most ferocious, the most feared fighter in all of the land. But if you read the biblical account, there's all kinds of strange and puzzling things in the description of Goliath, which don't make him sound like a ferocious giant warrior at all. So first of all, there's a thing in the story of, a bit in the story of Goliath, about how when he first comes down to the valley floor, he's led there by an attendant. Someone is bringing him down to meet David in the valley, right? Now, if he's such a ferocious warrior, why on earth does he need someone to lead him down to his position on the valley floor? Then there's the fact that he seems to take an awful long time to figure out what David is up to. David's coming from way up on the ridge, and he's not wearing any armor. He's dressed like a shepherd with a staff, and yet Goliath takes forever to kind of make sense of that fact. He still seems to think that what he's doing is he's having a sword fight with a guy, right? Why is Goliath so oblivious to what's going on with David? Then there's the fact that the biblical story makes specific mention of how slowly Goliath moves. That's another weird thing to say about a guy who's supposed to be a mighty warrior. And then there's that weird thing he says. Remember when he cries out because he's so insulted at the sight of David, he says, "Am I a dog that you would come to me with sticks?" Why does he say sticks? David doesn't have sticks. He only has one stick. Well, it turns out there's this very fascinating group of scholars who in the last 30 or 40 years have put forth a more complicated explanation of what's going on with Goliath. They've begun to argue that Goliath had something wrong with him. The first mention of this theory was in 1960 in the Indiana State Medical Journal by a prominent endocrinologist. And all of the endocrinologists have subsequently rushed in and offered all of their own theories about what possibly was awry with Goliath. And the consensus is that Goliath was suffering from something called acromegaly. Acromegaly is a disease caused by a benign tumor on your pituitary gland. And the tumor causes an overproduction of human growth hormone, with the result that people get very large. They become giants, right? In fact, many of the most famous giants in history are thought to have had acromegaly. The wrestler Andre the Giant, right? You'll remember him. He had acromegaly. The tallest man of all time, Robert Wadlow, who died at the age of 24 at a height of 8'11", and he was still growing, had acromegaly. There's even a group of scholars who think that Abraham Lincoln had acromegaly. Anytime you see someone who is unusually tall for his or her generation, that's one possible or leading explanation for their giantism. Well, acromegaly has one significant side effect, and that is that sometimes the tumors grow so large that they start to compress the optic nerves, with the result that people with suffering from acromegaly can have vision problems, either have severely restricted vision or they have double vision. Well, now think about that in the context of what I've said was odd about Goliath's behavior, right? Why is he led onto the valley floor by an attendant? Because he can't get down there by himself, right? He can't see much more than this much in front of his face. Why does he move so slowly? Well, because he's scared about tripping and falling on the valley floor. Why is he so oblivious to the fact that David's clearly not going to have a sword fight with him? Because he doesn't see David until the very last moment. And then when he says, come to me that I might feed your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field, that's a statement not just about his bravado, but about his vulnerability. He means, come to me. I can't see you otherwise, right? And then when he says, am I a dog that you would come to me with sticks? He sees 2 sticks, right? When David has only one, because he has double vision. So there are the Israelites up on the mountaintop, and they look down at this giant, and they're terrified of him. But what they don't realize is that everything that makes him seem so terrifying is actually the source of his weakness. And the lesson in that is as powerful and important today as it was 3,000 years ago. Right? Giants are not what they seem. And sometimes shepherds have a sling in their pocket.